we'll get started. Thanks. So hi, everyone. It's great to have you all here for Voters Will Tax Themselves for Kids, our webinar on the results of our and many other communities and states and organizations polls. We're really excited to talk to you about the results that we've recently gotten. My name is Olivia Allen, and I'm the strategy director at Children's Funding Project, where some of you might be more familiar with us and some of you might not, but we're a hands-on technical assistance organization and provide a wide variety of resources to communities looking to engage in strategic financing and strategic finance planning when it comes to all the stuff for children and youth that happens between prenatal and career outside of the K-12 school day. Quickly, I just want to let folks know we will have a Q&A section at the end. Since we're moving through kind of a couple of panelists pretty quickly, I do want to make sure we don't get stuck on questions for too long. So please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat area, and we will collect those and ask them in the Q&A section at the end, or ask you, we'll unmute you and ask you to ask. We'll also share slides by email after the webinar. And we're excited that you're going to hear from a couple of exciting partners that I will introduce as we go. And just for one quick brief piece of framing here, it's been kind of amazing how quickly the questions that we're hearing from folks about where voters are and what that means about the policy options we have for everything from early childhood to after school to career development for youth, how quickly those questions have changed. Just back last spring, we were getting so many questions about whether voters were still going to be willing to tax themselves given recession and economic hardship. And now we're getting questions about how are we going to convince voters to tax themselves given state surpluses and American Rescue Plan Act and the potential Build Back Better Act. And we really wanted to ground ourselves in an understanding of what voters understand and believe, particularly when it comes to some of the hard policy and program choices that we have to make, and some of the funding questions that we ask voters when we go to the ballot or lobby with legislators. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dave Metz, who's a partner at FM3 Research and who conducted our national poll and meta-analysis this year, to share with you more about the results of that work.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Olivia. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And it's especially a pleasure because I get to deliver some good news, which is despite all of the turbulence of the last couple of years on the fronts of public health and politics and the economy, our recent research nationally shows emphatically that voters remain supportive of making investments in children and youth and are willing to tax themselves in order to support them. I'm going to start out by just giving you an overview of some of the key findings as it relates to voters' willingness to tax themselves that come from two different research projects. A national poll that, as Olivia noted, we conducted with over 1,000 voters late this summer, as well as an analysis of 56 sets of poll data from states, counties, and cities all over the country, including many folks represented on this call who've been looking at these issues at the local level. There's a lot of consistency between what we saw in the national poll and what folks have been seeing at the local level, and a lot of the news is very encouraging. As we'll see on the next slide, when we're sort of talking at the high level of principle here, asking voters to identify things that they see as priorities at the national level, giving children a strong start in life is one of the things that they see as most important and urgent right now. 82% rate it either an extremely or very important priority, compared to 83% who say the same for strengthening the economy, and much more than say the same for reducing taxes and government spending, 63%. So yes, voters do want to see our economy improve, but that has done nothing to diminish their enthusiasm for making investments that will help children get off to a strong start. This sentiment also cuts across regions of the country. And in fact, is underscored by the fact that voters are willing to take money out of their own pockets in order to support these investments. The regional percentages that you'll see arrayed across the national map here represent the proportion of voters in each region who would support paying up to $100 per year in taxes out of their own pocket to support these investments in kids in their region. So this is something that across the country right now has broad support from voters. And when we drill down a little bit, many voters are willing to pay even more than that. We asked our respondents in the national survey if they'd be willing to pay a variety of different annual amounts, and also tested a variety of monthly amounts to see whether breaking it down in monthly units affected voters' willingness to pay. And frankly, the news was good across the board. It didn't matter whether we expressed the cost annually or on a per month basis. We have sizable majorities of voters. In fact, as many as 2/3 of those polled who tell us they would be willing to pay as much as $150 per year in additional taxes if it were dedicated to funding programs to support children and youth. As you'll see on the next slide, it also is striking that voters don't really discriminate between making investments in early childhood and supporting children of all ages. When we asked about a hypothetical proposal to increase funding through a tax increase at the local level, at the city or county level, to fund either childcare, preschool, and early childhood services or programs and services to support children of all ages, voters in principle were willing to support such tax increases regardless of what age group it applied to. 57% for early childhood, and then 61% when we're talking about programs for all children. These sentiments, to a remarkable degree, cut across all the major demographic subgroups of the American electorate. Here we're combining the data on support for a tax increase in principle across the different age groups that we tested with our split sample, and you'll see some of the key patterns that emerge. Women, more supportive than men, although majorities across gender lines are in favor. Overwhelming majority of Democrats expressing support, 87%, but also a plurality of independent voters nationally, 49-39, and even among Republicans who are skeptical about tax increases, regardless of how they're directed, we have more than 1/3 who indicate that they would be willing to see a local increase in taxes for these purposes. When we combine the variables of party and age, you'll see some interesting dynamics here. Overall, independents were a little bit mixed in their level of support, but younger independent voters, those under age 50, and that frankly is the lion's share of independents these days, are highly supportive, with almost 2/3 indicating that they would favor a local tax increase to support children and youth. It's really the older independents that are somewhat more skeptical. The support also cut across different types of communities. Voters in more urban areas, which is obviously where Democrats tend to be concentrated, expressed the strongest support, with more than 7 in 10 favoring this kind of a local tax increase. But even in suburban, small town, and rural areas, where typically there are more conservative voters, tend to be a little bit more tax averse, we still had a majority of at least 51% across these types of communities telling us they would favor this type of tax increase. So summarized here, you'll see the proportions of voters that would be willing to pay each sort of dollar amount more. 70% are willing to pay at least $25, and again, 64% willing to pay that $150 annual amount. So it's good to see that however the money is raised, at the bottom line, voters are willing to take it out of their own pockets to support children and youth. But we also wanted to understand what kinds of funding mechanisms they might see as the most acceptable ways to raise these dollars. And the funding mechanisms you see listed on this slides are the ones that voters nationally found most broadly acceptable, with at least 64% indicating that each would be an acceptable way of raising money to fund these kinds of programs. A lot of them are ones that are explicitly progressive in their funding structure. Sales of commercial property over $1 million, corporate profits, either digital advertising sales or sales of personal data collected online, and then taxes on high income earners as well. Voters are increasingly concerned about income inequality, and they see taxes like this that have that kind of progressive framework as ones that they view as the most acceptable ways to raise more money. So that gives you a sense of the national picture. I'll hand it back to Olivia now, and I think we're going to hear more about how this is playing out in some specific local communities.
Thanks, Dave. So that was a very efficient overview of our national poll results and meta-analysis results, and we'll get a little more in the weeds with those as we go on, but we wanted to kind of add to that discussion by bringing to you experts about 2 recent polls in different parts of the country at different levels to talk about what does this actually mean in their communities. So up first, we have Christian Sinderman and Aaron Schultz of NWP Consulting to talk to us a bit about the Renew Best Starts for Kids campaign in King County that ended successfully this August, and what their poll asked and found and how they navigated that. So Christian and Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, I'll get started, and Aaron will jump in. And but yeah, I think, you know, and I think this national trend that Dave, you identified, is really, you know, when you get to see on the ground results and behaviors with voters and what they want to invest in, it really is pretty remarkable. And it's very reassuring that there's still some goodness left in our divided and polarized society, that, you know, there's some aspirational goals and some real equity commitments. And I say that knowing that, you know, King County, Washington is a large and largely progressive, well-educated jurisdiction, so clearly doesn't reflect, it isn't truly representative of the national landscape, but we saw some of the same dynamics here. Just for go ahead and advance the slide, Olivia, if you can. So the Best Starts for Kids started in 2005. No, 2015. I'm skipping ahead here. It was the brainchild of our current county executive, working with researchers at the University of Washington and topical experts in criminal legal reform, early childhood learning, unions, et cetera, and a lot of service providers. And really, the renewal was an expansion upon a foundation that included prenatal to 5 programs, a lot of healthy home and nursing access programs, youth intervention and engagement, to really help caregivers, teachers, and others identify and really target outreach and support for kids and teens. Targeted equity investments in underrepresented and communities of color, and youth and family homelessness prevention, which is an acute crisis everywhere, but in King County, where there's a lot of wealth disparities, and homelessness has become an overwhelming crisis. The other foundational aspects that were targeted for growth in the renewal were a lot of out of school and after school programs, but with the pandemic being what it is and continues to be, the need for supplemental and wraparound services and care became a bigger issue, of course, as well as some additional health programs within schools. And then the new investments in childcare are really part of this, to create 3,000 slots for low income and working families, and also to establish a wage structure that allows for less turnover, more stability, and higher quality within the childcare provider community, and allowing people who care for kids to live and work in the same communities where they're raising their own families potentially. So really sort of, again, thinking about how we're improving the stability of our childcare. I said the initial polling was actually fairly mixed. Again, we're working with an August primary, so a lower turnout election, which even in King County is still pushing 50% because we have all vote by mail, but nevertheless, a smaller, more conservative electorate. So we didn't start with the kind of overwhelming support that we normally would want, and it represented a drop, again, because of some issues with the economy, and some uncertainty around how services were provided, especially some of the in-school and some of the institutional investments that were a little disrupted. It's a fairly expensive levy, but actually we support increased when you explained how much it would cost. I think we find in a lot of these and types of measures that when you throw out large numbers, people don't fully understand what they are. But when you break it down to what's going to cost you monthly, it is reassuring. A balanced pro-con statement did drop support, still about 50%, but certainly had an impact. Again, sort of preying on fears of a lack, both of the economic instability of the times, but also a lot of programs are not fully quantifiable. We're dealing with a lot of qualitative impacts. You can talk about how many families have been kept out of homelessness. You can talk about how many kids have received outreach or behavioral health support, but it's hard to truly quantify all the impacts for the money. And so there's a little bit of nervousness around that. In the end, the punchline is we did win with 62% of the vote by running a fairly aggressive campaign, really relying on spokespeople and impacted communities and really authentic voices as opposed to politicians. This is the kind of human story that again reflects in the national numbers. People want to know that kids are being helped. They want to hear from the people who are receiving the benefits. And we benefit, of course, also from having no formal opposition, so that balanced pro-con was never an issue. But it was great to see people rally around the renewal, and especially at a larger dollar amount, and especially with the added investments in childcare and childcare workers, which wasn't a top line message, but was still powerful. Again, just really quickly on some of the message slides, we found that the top messages for our election were around prevention. People understand the value of early intervention as a way to avoid downstream impacts and costs. Support for communities of color. Then the foundational beginnings from prenatal through childcare through teen, creating that arc of services that really support kids and give them the right start. Final slide, I believe. These are sort of second tier, but the gender, the disproportionate gender impacts around COVID, disruption to women in the workforce and family structures and family stability as a result, really were very prominent, and the child care access was critical there. And again, a lot of the child care workers, the child care worker investments, and just dealing with some of the inequities that are very specific around the child care piece. I believe that covers all of our stuff. Erin, I rushed that pretty quickly. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I love Olivia's recap that the support increased when people when they heard about the amount of money that we were asking for, and ultimately we're funding $750 million over a very short period of time for kids. So it was an incredible achievement, and voters showed up for it.
Yeah, great. Thanks to you both, and we'll come back for a little bit of dialogue and discussion in a few minutes. And I appreciate everybody throwing questions into the Q&A. They're great questions, and we'll definitely cover those. And I hope our next presenter gives a little bit of an answer, one insight into some of the questions about whether it matters whether a tax is proposed at the local, state, or federal level, and whether there are differences between red and blue states, because we are handing it over to Libby Saunier in Louisiana to talk instead of a local blue measure. She's going to talk about a redder state piece of policy and the polling that informs that. So Libby, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Olivia. Again, I'm Libby Sonia. I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, and I don't think you get more red than Louisiana. And so what I'm going to share with you today is about some statewide polling that we have done, in particular to sin taxes, and I'll give you some context to that as you look at this next slide. And so we were looking to see what kind of support we could understand that would happen for sports betting in our state. Back in 2019, our state legislature had to vote to say if sports betting could go to the people to vote to see if they would be willing to bring that to the state. And how it got, it passed in 2019 and it came to us as the people in 2020. But how it got past the legislature to go to the people was, this is a really good funding source for early care and education. And so when we had done polling in 2019 to use that to help our legislature understand like this would be a potential source for early care and education. So we did it again last spring, of this past spring in 2021, once the 650 something of our parishes, of the 62 parishes, which are counties everywhere else, said that we would want to tax sports betting. And so we were going into a fiscal session in the state of Louisiana where we had to make sure that we wanted to get that revenue for early care and education from sports betting. And so the polling took place. And what we did is we found that, voters really supported taxing gaming facilities and online sports betting to fund early care and education. It was really important for us to understand that it wasn't just gaming facilities, it was also online sports betting, because we're really where the revenue comes from is when you can bet online. And so to understand that our state people said, we want to tax sports betting and we want it to go to early care and education. And we want to make sure it's not just the facilities it is sport, it's also online sports betting. But you all know this, polling's expensive. And so in thinking about the expense of it, and we worked with a known conservative polling company called Ragnar, and said, if we're going to spend this kind of money investing in a poll, we want to see if we can get some longevity to it. So we also included related to sports, related to taxing, supporting early care and education, related to nicotine products, marijuana, and alcoholic beverages. Little did we know at the time that marijuana would be quite the hot topic in our legislature that year. And so it was good that we had polled all these sin taxes, because what we also found out is that our people would say, if you're going to tax recreational marijuana, we would want part of that revenue to go towards early care and education. And so that became increasingly important as we saw what was coming through the legislature to say, like, this is where our people are. The questions asked were, do you oppose or support taxing gaming facilities where sports betting is taking place to fund early care and education? Do you oppose or support taxing online sports betting to fund early care and education? And if recreational marijuana were to be legal, would you oppose or support taxing marijuana to fund early care and education? And so recreational marijuana has not been fully legalized yet, but we were able to get some steps in place. So thinking ahead, we've got polling to support it when it's time. And so that's exciting. Next slide. And so when we think about, support for the variety of different taxing mechanisms, what's really cool here is that it's a bipartisan for really allocating these funds, the sports betting revenue, to early care and education over just the state general fund. That's important. So what happens, we often talk about, well, we don't want to dedicate funding, but when if we don't dedicate in Louisiana, it just goes to whatever people decide they're going to do and not really make strategic decisions particularly related to young children in our state. And that our voters really recognize the important role of childcare, and that they valued investing in sports betting revenue. And so the end of the story is this: we use this polling at every turn through the legislature. If somebody was talking about early childhood, we were talking about polling. And the end was very beneficial. We now have 20 million reasons to celebrate young children in the state of Louisiana. We were able to garner 25% of the sports betting revenue to go into the Early Childhood Education Fund, which is a 1-to-1 match. So if locals come up with $1, if there's enough money in that fund, they can get a dollar match. And so 25% of sports betting revenue up to $20 million is going into that incentive fund. My greatest hope is in a couple of years, I have to work very, very hard to get that cap taken off. And so that, because what we know is from the first year that sports betting is fully in place, that's up to $6 to $7 million in that incentive fund. And so I'm hoping that we have to remove it. I will say this, as excited as we are about having this revenue in the fund, that barely funds the state's child care assistance program for a month. So to keep it in context, like this is the largest investment that we've had in the fund, but we have miles yet to go. But when you have this kind of polling and you can use this kind of data, it has power. And what we saw is it was put in the press at all turns. It was also used by different groups and coalitions to say, we want to invest in our young children in the state, and our people are supporting that.
Thanks, Libby. That was great. You drew all the connections I was hoping you would draw. And just to draw one more for folks, I hope you'll kind of take a look when we send out the slides and take a look at how our national results and these local and state results stack up. There are some differences and nuances where you go, and there are some similarities and continuous trends. So we'll be producing a couple more materials and we'll touch on some of that as well. I'm going to stop sharing just for a few minutes to have a little bit of a dialogue with you all before we dive further into some of the data on what folks feel about actual programs and systems beyond the funding. But Erin and Christian, I wanted to start with you because Libby just did such a wonderful job of covering how she used the polling. And Christian and Erin, I'm wondering whether there is a stakeholder or group of stakeholders that stands out to you as being a group that the polling that you shared, the numbers that you shared really made a difference with, whether it was saying, our polling's lower than we want and we need funding for this, or our polling is high here. So in your district, so you should support this. Wondering whether you have an anecdote on that you could share.
Yeah, I can start, and Christian, please jump in. I think not surprisingly, because it was a campaign, we definitely used the results to demonstrate to people how vulnerable the campaign was and how, I think especially because it was a renewal, there were so many organizations and funders who were so invested in continuing the program. And so it gave us the opportunity to say, we're at risk of losing that funding, and that's nothing that anyone is willing to risk. And so I think it made folks come in at a higher level than they definitely otherwise would have. Christian, you have any other?
Yeah, I think, what we found was sort of interesting in a renewal environment is, one, we had some folks who sort of took it for granted, right? It's like, oh, well, you won last time. This is all wonderful. Everyone loves kids. What's the big deal? So we had to do a little bit of a sales pitch to get people to truly commit and to reinvest. The second and sort of sad point is we had some investors in the first campaign and the first iteration of this measure that did not come back because they didn't like the direction we went. They didn't like some of the childcare and workforce investments. They wanted truly targeted every dollar into these very specific programs around youth, and did not like sort of the ancillary additions of how are we lifting and creating sort of the support network. So it was some tension within that funding network too. But we were able to use the polling to both drive those parallel conversations around reinvestment and in around why we were moving in this different direction, both from a necessity and a values proposition, but also in a value proposition to voters, that they supported this directional shift. But the polling was super critical in helping, justify both the budget we assembled, but also the, kind of why we were moving the direction we were in terms of policy.
Right. I think we have a lot of conversations about this with folks all over the country of kind of, well, if support is so high, why hasn't my community supported this policy or that policy? And that's, one of the things we use polling for, right, is to understand that nuance. Where do we need to tweak something to turn that policy from a theoretical into a reality? Dave, could you share maybe a couple of the ways that you see folks effectively use polling to help them translate policy from theoretical to reality?
Sure. I think there's sort of three main uses that polling can play when you have either a legislative policy you're trying to push through or a ballot measure. And I think you've heard Libby and Aaron and Christian reference these in their work. The first is helping you design the policy the right way. Obviously, you have some policy goals in mind that are informed by real world needs and gaps that have to be filled. But there may be cases where you could design it to look like A or look like B. And there isn't a compelling policy argument for one or the other. A poll can tell you if voters have a strong feeling one way or the other and sort of push you in a direction that hopefully will build a bigger popular consensus. The second is around communications. If you need to talk to the public, either to mobilize voices in support of the policy or ultimately get votes at the ballot box, you need to know what messages, what types of expenditures are the things that generate the most excitement around the public. And polling can help you to figure out which things to talk about. Of the many things you can say are benefits of a policy in order to get the most animated and positive response. And third, as you've heard the last couple of speakers highlight, polling is a tool to demonstrate for external audiences the popularity and viability of the policy that you're putting forward. Many donors won't write a check unless they can see some polling that shows that this is a popular and viable idea. There may be potential coalition members that will be hesitant to sign their names until they know it's a popular and winning cause. And polling can help you document that for those audiences in ways that can sort of increase their enthusiasm and help to get them on board.
Thanks, Dave. And Libby, I'll just ask you one additional question. I know your poll really focused on that decision point around which funding mechanism was worth pursuing. Were there any other pieces of the puzzle or decisions that your poll helped your team make?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, if I think about how the legislative session went, where we were being hit from different sides to kind of pull the plug related to sports betting and shift completely what we were doing. We held the line. However, at the same time, medical marijuana had come up as a potential taxing revenue source for us. And I had been advised to just shift completely to that. If we had shifted completely to medical marijuana, we would have gotten nothing this last legislative session. So using the data to say, we know our people support this and our people elect you. That became really, really important and helpful as we navigated the course in a legislative session. But also, if I think back to our 2019 poll that we were really looking at about potential taxation and increasing investment in early care and education, we were able to use that 2019 poll to really hit hard during our gubernatorial election of 2019. And to say people want increased investments in early care and education. And as you, as somebody that is running for an elected official position, what's your stance on early care and education? What's your stance on early childhood? So to be able to use the polling in multiple ways with different avenues becomes increasingly important. Again, it's expensive to do. And so if you're going to do it, you want to make sure you're getting a lot of runway with it.
Great. Thanks, Libby. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dave before we do some Q&A, just for a few minutes to talk about some of the decision points or elements of programs and policy in early childhood and in older youth and after school that impact levels of support that voters express. So Dave?
Great, thank you, Olivia. So earlier we talked about the sort of the front end of the process, getting money, sort of building support for new revenue to support kids. The other end of the spectrum is once that revenue is available, where are voters most enthusiastic about it being invested? And one hurdle that we anticipate we might have to get past in having that conversation with voters is what they've been hearing about increased federal funding to support children and youth, both as part of the American Rescue Plan and then as part of Build Back Better. What the polling showed us at the national level is that very few voters believe that federal action is going to sort of solve the funding needs in their own community. Fewer than 1 in 10 are very confident that federal dollars are going to sort of fully take care of their local needs, and 60% tell us they think that there will be a need for additional local funding to support investments in children and youth. And I think this is very consistent with what we've seen in a number of local surveys that have been conducted over the past few months. Voters are grateful for federal aid when and if it comes, but understand that they're still going to have to take action at the local level to really address the gaps that are present. So what are some of the things that they see as the highest priorities for investment? There are certainly lots of programs that affect young children that voters view as being high priorities. You'll see a number of them detailed here. High quality infant and toddler childcare, high quality preschool programs, and maternal and infant health services. In each case, we have at least 2/3 of voters nationally who are telling us that they view them as high priorities for investment. And part of this stems from a trend that we've seen in recent polling where the pandemic has really heightened voters' awareness of some of the gaps in terms of support for parents with young children. This is data from a survey that we completed in Washington State last year, where we asked voters about their level of concern with a variety of issues facing Washington. And while a number of the items at the top of the list are the ones you would expect, the economic and health impacts of the pandemic, the cost of housing, the economy, and cost of living, it's notable that right up there on a par with them is the concern that voters express about the challenge parents face balancing childcare and work responsibilities during the pandemic. 71% of Washington voters at that point rated that as a very serious problem. And even in more recent months, as the sort of immediate impact of the pandemic has receded, we've seen a continuing awareness of the sort of weakness in our system of childcare that has been exposed and sort of heightened by the pandemic. So if voters are willing to make investments in early childhood, what are some of the things that they see as being most important? One of the ways we have explored this in past research that we did for the National Association for the Education of Young Children was to look at factors that voters think contribute to a quality early childhood education program. We gave our respondents a long list of different elements of quality and asked them to rate how important they thought each one was on a 4-point scale as either extremely, very, somewhat, or not too important. The items you'll see on this slide are the ones that at least 4 and 5 rated as being very important. So the very high end of the scale, the things they see as the biggest contributors to quality. And obviously patient and compassionate teachers, teachers who meet state and local standards, who have degrees in childhood development and or early education, all are things that matter a great deal to the public. The role of educators is absolutely central. And part of that, I'm sorry, Olivia, if we just go back for 1 minute, they recognize that to have teachers who meet these high levels of qualification requires that they be compensated fairly. And you'll see that item third from the bottom there, 85% of voters nationally believe it's important to have teachers who are well compensated. A trend that we've seen continuing in the data, and I think perhaps with a little more urgency since the start of the pandemic, is the recognition of how underpaid early childhood educators are, and the importance of making sure that their compensation is on a par with the high standards that we expect of them to keep talented educators in the profession. On the next slide, sort of building on this theme, you'll see a range of elements that were part of our national survey that indicated the importance that voters face on having this sort of stable pool of providers. We've got 3 in 5 respondents telling us that it is very important to stabilize nonprofit and small business childcare, preschool, and after-school programs, and to combat the shortage of qualified staff through increasing wages. So voters are connecting these dots pretty clearly. It's also important to note that part of the reason voters think it's essential to pay early childhood educators what they are worth is they see them as being absolutely critical to the life of a community. This is going back to the work that we did for NEYC a couple of years ago. We asked respondents how important they view early childhood educators as being to the life of their community. And they are right up there on a par with firefighters, nurses, occupations that we know that voters hold in really high regard. And so the esteem that voters give to early childhood educators translates into their belief that they really should be well paid. It also ties to their recognition, as you'll see on the next slide, that this is not easy work. Only 23% of our respondents in that national survey believe that early childhood educators have fairly easy jobs or are easily replaceable. They recognize instead that they are highly skilled. They're valued by the community. And ideally, as you'll see in that item at the top of the slide, 78% of American voters said they believe that early childhood educators can make a long-term career of their work in early education. But again, only if they're paid wages that allow them to make a living doing this important work. So that's one end of the spectrum, sort of early childhood. What we see in the data at the same time is that voters also place a high priority on making investments to support older children and youth. Again, when we ask people to prioritize investments in a variety of service areas, you'll see that more than 7 in 10 prioritize investments in after-school and summer programs and youth mental health services, which obviously serve older children and young people. So there is no diminishment in the priority that voters attach to supporting older children compared to their support for early childhood. This was also clear in a couple of other questions where we asked voters in the national survey to rate the priority attached to other kinds of investments. You saw, I mentioned earlier, the importance they attach to provider stability and having addressing the shortage of staff. That is for after-school programs just as much as it is for early childhood education. And there's also a high priority, 71% of voters rating it very important, attached to mental health services that help youth overcome some of the challenges they are facing. Even before the start of the pandemic, there was a recognition among voters that we don't pay enough attention to the mental health struggles that young people face. And that certainly has become worse as many young people have spent 3/4 of the last 2 school years in some form of remote education that has kept them from being with their peers and having the sort of healthy social and emotional environments that young people rely on. So again, some areas where voters really feel emphatic about making investments in older children and youth as well. And it's always important to note that the desire that voters have to invest in these programs only really can be translated into effective political support if it is compared to other areas of investment that voters are being asked to support at the same time. They may care about kids, but they also care about public safety and public health and transportation and roads and libraries and things like that. It's encouraging to see that in polling, voters do support investments in programs for youth at roughly the same level that they do many of these other competing priorities that are held up at the same time. And we saw earlier at the federal level in our national poll, voters rank helping kids get off to a strong start as being just as important as investing in strengthening the economy. So there is a strong case for us to make that not just in absolute terms, but even in relative terms. This is something that is urgent for voters and potentially gaining urgency, again, as the pandemic has highlighted some of the gaps in services that are available. Finally, on this last slide, we highlight some of the specific areas of investment that in our meta-analysis of those 56 different surveys really stood out as consistent areas where voters wanted to see investments made. Increasingly, that is helping children and families who are experiencing homelessness. This tends to be most acute in big cities and more acute on the West Coast than it is in other parts of the country, but always a very high priority, as well as helping children who are victims of abuse or neglect, who are experiencing poverty or hunger, whose lives have been affected by substance use disorder, and also addressing bullying. So those specific challenges that young people face are ones that voters tend to have a higher degree of enthusiasm for directing their investments to address. So with that, I will hand it back to Olivia.